Welcome to MSUA's The Pulse, where we speak with leaders from across the mobile technology and satellite industries about the future of connectivity, communications, and enterprise technology. I'm your host, Lisa Dreher. Our session today is focused on the past, present, and future of telecom constellations. Our guest brings a disruptor's perspective on this topic. Mark Matossian is the founder of Efficient Frontier Space, as well as co-founder of Solstar Space. He's also a veteran of Google, plus he's worked on more than 10 constellation efforts over the years. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, thanks for having me, Lisa.
Absolutely. Maybe we can start by just having you give a little bit more background on your experience and what you've seen so far.
All right, thank you. First, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on the Pulse. It's a great series, and I'm really pleased to participate. For my background, I'm an aerospace engineer by trade. My doctorate was in multi-satellite constellation design optimization. I also worked in Russian studies, or as we would have called it back then, Soviet studies. And I started out working on the Strategic Defense Initiative, what was called Star Wars at the time, and the early LEO constellations, low Earth orbit constellations, which we'll be talking about. And then I spent quite a bit of time in Silicon Valley. I live there now. And I worked on several startups, including some terrestrial wireless telecom, 13 years at Google. And now I'm working with new space startups and established aerospace companies through my consultancy, Efficient Frontier Space.
Great. Thanks for that background. Now, we wanted to talk to you today about kind of LEO 1.0 and talk about, what was missing, what went wrong, and how did we get to where we are today, and what's the future looking like for LEO 2.0? So maybe we can start by kind of saying, okay, how did we get to where we are today?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny that we even can just call it LEO 1.0 and people know what we're talking about, because the impact of the internet has changed just the way we talk about technology. We didn't always talk about version numbers like software, but we'll see how all of that technology development really has changed the environment from the first round of constellations to today. So I would say that constellations first started to really come about out of the military, out of the Cold War, from GPS and from SDI. And a lot of those systems, while especially GPS, are tremendously successful and impactful, but with the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of, I would say, excess industrial capacity available, would be the polite economic term for it. And this incredible opportunity for people that were interested in leveraging that sort of approach to telecom. And we have to go, when we talk about sort of LEO 1.0, we're really going into the way back machine a bit, because we have to reimagine where we were. This is the 90s. What was going on in the industry? What were the markets like? And how did people get their telecom services? Because it was a very different environment, and we're in a different place now. It will be a fun exploration of that.
So I guess what went wrong for LEO 1.0? Where did we miss the boat, or what wasn't in place at that time that made it not work out?
Yeah, I think the clearest answer, of course, is by the evidence, is the cost, because all of those ventures went bankrupt or dipped into bankruptcy, and wiped out their debt and survived in one manner or another, like Globalstar and Iridium. But there was still a high cost structure that couldn't quite bridge to the numbers of satellites that we needed in that period. So it was a high capital requirement relative to the time. I think it probably would have gotten a bit farther than it did, but then capital markets closed in 2000, with the dot-com bust, and there was a general economic pullback. And so there was just no way that these very capital intensive projects could get funded at that time. So the technology was getting there to do constellations, but it wasn't where we are now. And so it was still expensive. The capital markets couldn't support it any longer. And so and then the markets kind of shifted a bit. So the broadband systems never got built. Essentially, the sort of voice-oriented systems, Iridium, Globalstar, ICO, kind of struggled with the shifts in the market. So again, way back, Machine, remember, this is the time when cellular networks were being rapidly built out worldwide, right? We were past the big brick phone. This is more in the kind of, golden age of Nokia and Motorola days. And so as they were trying to build out the constellation with very expensive permanent costs, ground networks were being rapidly built out as well. So markets were shifting.
Yeah. So when you look at LEO 1.0 and the organizations that were kind of coming into the market and trying to launch these constellations, was there a way that they could have made it work? Or was it just all of those factors were just, it was a timing thing. It was just not the right time.
I think it was just ahead of its time. I think there were, they couldn't carry the debt. Mm-hmm. Certainly we used to talk about little LEOs and big LEOs and mega LEOs. And the little LEOs were the store and forward solutions, right? This is more like Orbcomm from Orbital Sciences, now swallowed up by Northrop. Big LEOs were a little more voice-oriented, some data, what we would still consider narrowband today. Iridium, Globalstar, ICO, typical. Mm-hmm. And then the mega LEOs, and that's maybe best exemplified by Teledesic. And Skybridge was the European competitor in that category. And so the little LEOs, you could think of it as maybe almost a precursor to an IoT kind of thing, like picking up status from a remote oil well or something like that. It was more in that kind of a market. Remember, this is a pager market, like the global pager, but no one has a pager anymore. So, how long would that have lasted? It would have had to explore new markets.
Right.
Little LEOs, they battled the build out of the terrestrial cellular network, as I said, and Iridium really for many years just struggled to find an application for its very narrowband data. It just doesn't have a lot of bandwidth. Now, the newer Iridium is more capable and has carved out a niche. And then the mega LEOs, they never really got built. But I think the interesting thing is that I can say, because I worked at Teledesic, I spent several years there, and the fundamental premise of Teledesic was dead on accurate, because again, 90s perspective, we were still in a circuit switched world, which means you pick up your house telephone, right, on a hard wire, and you have a dedicated switched circuit connection to the person that you're talking to. And the fundamental premise of Teledesic was circuit switched networks are dead. Everything will be IP. Everything will be internet protocol packets. And all communications will be broken down into packets with independent routing. And that was right. I mean, it's not often that 20 years later, you can go back and go, especially for a venture that wasn't successful, and go, yeah, they were onto something.
Yeah. So just timing, right?
Well, and the challenge was the cost, right?
Sure.
We got pretty far, but when the capital markets closed, even though it was backed by Bill Gates and Craig McCaw, who founded what is now AT&T Cellular, AT&T Wireless, they pulled the plug.
Right. So now the loaded
maybe
question.
It was the right decision. It was probably the right decision, after when the public markets closed.
Right. Right. So here's the the whatever $100 billion question. Will LEO 2.0 make it or suffer the same fate as 1.0?
Yeah, that is the multi-billion-dollar question. So a lot has changed, and that's the fun of it. But so let's take a look at what's changed, because it really is a different environment now. So if we break it up into the technology and the money and investment topic, and then the markets. So the tech has definitely changed, for sure. Remember, in that intervening time, we have laptops, right? Laptops, were pretty clunky back then, and they were battery limited. And laptops drove a lot of battery development. And then that folded into smartphone batteries and really enabled smartphones to, kind of be useful in a lot of ways. And the screens folded into smartphone screens, which didn't show up until about 2008, I think, for the first iPhone and Android phones.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, isn't that amazing? So again, the perspective shift here is you had this laptop and smartphone revolution. Laptops first, just from the tech, and then smartphones because it also brought in all the wireless and Wi-Fi elements to it that laptops initially didn't have. Second, I would say that the chips and Linux and open source software is in a really different place now. So if you look at something like Starlink, they have the opportunity now to fly incredibly powerful networking electronics on their spacecraft and they are running thousands of instances of Linux in orbit. Thousands. So that, we just didn't have that kind of, you're basically flying a network router in space, right? And so there's just so much more capacity now, and the opportunity to have more spacecraft and more denser, sophisticated networking, which they're certainly doing. So that's a big difference. Small satellites, with CubeSats and on a to ESPA class spacecraft, much more powerful now. Also a lot more volume, more standardization of parts. So the cost of spacecraft has really dropped significantly from where we were. I would say don't neglect the user group. Not only are the antennas better, and you can do phased array antennas in orbit now far better than we were able to back then, but look at the Starlink user equipment. I mean, they like to make a joke that it's a little spaceship or something, but hey, that is a active phased array antenna. That's big. LEO 1.0, we're trying to figure dishes suck, right? Who wants a one? You can't. You need make before break, right? So you need two dishes,
Right.
and phased arrays, having affordable active phased array antennas now, fantastic.
Yeah.
Right, and it just opens up a lot more applications, especially for mobile.
Sure.
So the antenna technology and the cost of the antenna technology has really improved. And then the last thing on technology is really about the launch prices have dropped crazy. So you have, first of all, now you have launch brokers, which is great. And all that, excess capacity is being used up. You have SpaceX obviously just broke through the floor in opening up launch opportunities.
Yeah. So,
Thank you.
I mean, the commercialization of space, it just seems like in general, right, has really opened things up quite a lot.
It has. And, that, and with that came, VCs, venture capitalists willing to fund space, and private equity markets starting to get involved. We benefited in the last 11, 12 years for the most part, with an exception for the pandemic. One of the largest, if not the largest, bull run market in history. So a lot of available capital, and capital that is looking for a home. And that bull market was powered by tech and growth stocks. Like no one talks about value. No one's talked about value for a decade. So no one is saying, hey, Lisa, you should really buy Procter and Gamble. If this new cleanser coming out, it's going to be a winner. Like nobody says that anymore. And,
right.
Now value stocks may come back in, but the point is the capital markets have had a lot of capital. They're looking for homes. They're looking at tech, and they work their way up to space. And then you cannot avoid the topic of just the sheer wealth that has been concentrated especially in the case of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos.
Sure.
Because it's no accident that people that had a front row seat to the benefits of broadband development are the same ones that are now taking that enormous capital ability and deploying it towards broadband networks in space.
Right. So thinking about those players and maybe some others, right? A lot of those organizations either a lot of them have gotten their cash reserves from other business lines, right? And so when you look at the the OneWebs, which that's now come through bankruptcy, and there's a lot of interest there.
Hopefully it'll come back,
right? And then of course we have SpaceX, and we have Amazon coming into the fold with Kuiper. So and Telesat, and who am I forgetting, Mark?
Telesat's, it's now called Lightspeed.
Right, of course. So like, how do all these players come into this market, and like, is there enough demand, and who are all these users, right? What's kind of your take on all of these different players?
So I think those you listed the major ones, right? Like certainly the first here is Starlink, OneWeb, for a variety of reasons. It's still going, and we need to keep an eye on it, especially because they have certain frequency rates. Telesat, Lightspeed, and Kuiper. Those are the top four. And note, there is no mention on that list of anything that we would have called big LEOs or little LEOs previously.
Right.
Like all of that stuff is now blown away. Why? Because it's all IP packets now, all about broadband. And so, Iridium is not going to compete in that. They've got their own thing, good for them. But it's all about broadband. So everything that we're talking about constellations, LEO 2.0 is broadband. Note one. Second, the markets are now very changed, not just the IP packets, but people now appreciate low latency. Like people watching this podcast, right? If this was stuttering and, they would last about 15 seconds and then go screw it.
Right.
Like we just don't have the tolerance for low latency, especially for bidirectional communications. If it's just a straight video feed, to be honest, fine, it's just delayed and getting to you, but it's as long as it's a consistent stream, it's okay. But for bidirectional communications, latency to geo is still a problem. SES wisely recognized this, and in the meantime, they did build and deploy O3b into medium Earth orbit, MEO. That helped bring down the latency considerably, but not like LEO, right?
Right.
So there's low latency, there's geo disruption. The geo market's really been disrupted. Now people are trying to figure high throughput satellites like Viasat have now proven that the market can absorb a lot more bandwidth. And so everyone's trying to rethink their business plans. But there's a big innovator's dilemma element in there.
Sure.
Right? The parallel, of course, is, when Arianespace was watching the early days of SpaceX when they were blowing up rockets and then later saying like, we'll land boosters and reuse them and customers will take it and people will ensure that. And, Arianespace could go like, I don't think so. But look where we are now. Right?
Yeah.
And it is the innovator's dilemma. I mean, it wasn't an unreasonable position for them to take, but now with 2020 hindsight, they've got a big strategic problem. So similarly in geo, the geo operators need to figure out like, okay, O3b worked in MEO. Now what's happening with LEO? That is a major threat for them. And so they're going to have to take a hard look at their customers, their sub-markets, what's defensible, what's not, right? If you're just doing video feed, something like that, like latency doesn't matter, maybe the bandwidth is okay. And so that's all right. But there are other markets where either they're going to be under threat or there will be new markets they can't compete in.
Sure. Right.
So
at what point do you get to a place where the coverage is deep and broad enough? So for example, when you look at Starlink right now, as a potential user, they're putting a lot of sort of, you may not always have coverage, there's a lot of kind of, well, it's not going to be perfect right now. And,
right.
As you mentioned before, users don't have a lot of patience for not so perfect connectivity. So at what point do we have enough LEO satellites to get that level of coverage and reliable connectivity?
You're like, that's like asking like, when do I get my flying car? Right. I was promised a flying car. Right. So there are a couple ways to answer that. First of all, one of the cool things about SpaceX is SpaceX made space sexy again, right? It really wasn't kind of in fashion, like with new college graduates, in 2000. They were more interested in like the rise of the web. But SpaceX made it sexy again. And part of the way that they did it is they I don't know whether it's going to work. Like this might blow up, right? Like, and sometimes it did. And so, So, but if you think about it from a marketing perspective, it kind of brought the user along in the journey, and it made a bit of failure, especially spectacular failure, kind of okay. And now it becomes this entertainment vehicle, right?
Oh yeah, people like things that blow up,
I
right?
love it. And there's nothing that blows up better than aerospace stuff, right? Like you can't get better explosions than that. So the so there's as a result of that, for Starlink, there's a certain amount of tolerance. Like people will beta test stuff, and they will be a bit more accepting if there are bumps along the road, right?
Yeah.
Or early users will want to get, and then they'll blog about it, like, "Hey, I got this new Starlink thing, and let me, box opening video or whatever it is." So it's very participatory in that sense.
Yeah, I
Um,
think, oh, sorry.
but but I was going to say that, but there's another aspect behind it, which is regulatory, because remember, these are customers, so they can declare that they are operational, and they have regulatory requirements to achieve a certain deployment and achieve operations within a certain amount of time, because the regulatory requirements changed for from in the 90s and 2000 to 2020.
Well, so let's talk about that a little bit more, because it seems like the timing is a lot better than it ever has been. I think Elon Musk famously said at Satellite last year in an interview that,
Yeah.
I just want to be anything but bankrupt, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
yeah, yeah.
you know,
I was actually at that event, and it was really funny. I mean, typical Elon, he shows up like an hour late, and but someone asked him more or less the same questions, like, "What's your strategic goal?" Blah blah blah, and he's just cut the interviewer off at the knees and said, "I just don't want to go bankrupt. Like that's the only thing I want to do. Like everyone who's tried this in the past has gone bankrupt. I just don't want to go bankrupt."
right.
Period. I mean, which is a brilliant bit of like cutting it down to the core.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're spot on.
So there are other challenges, though, that still remain that could, I guess, impact either maybe how long it takes for 2.0 to really get a foothold,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
maybe we see more bankruptcy. So what
Yeah.
are these challenges that still remain?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, you have to separate what he says publicly with what his actual goals are, because he is a showman. But in terms of those goals, I think it's important to understand that even though we want this to be our flying car, in fact, one of the big challenges with constellations from a design point of view is that you really do have limited capacity on these spacecraft. And so when you come over a dense urban area, or a highly developed telecom market country, you can get saturated locally in your network. And so hence, the answer to that is usually kind of like 5G, more spacecraft, smaller footprints, smaller serving cells. But don't discount that these satellites are going to have their capacity limitations in dense areas.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as they build it out, it will be more and more capable, which is the nice part. But it might not be, the flying car that you wanted immediately. Now, in secondary markets, in developing countries, magic, right?
Sure.
Rural areas, even rural US, there's tremendous opportunities. We have a vast unserved and underserved, rural consumer and rural businesses. even rural infrastructure. I worked on one project where we were contacted by a major US cellular company that was trying to figure out how to do backhaul from some towers on a major US interstate. And they had a hole in their coverage and they just couldn't figure out, like, how do we backhaul that tower? And it's so even in the US, like, it's not just like developing world secondary markets. Like there's need for this stuff, but densification of demand is a challenge for constellations, especially at an early stage where they haven't been able to sort of crowd in and densify if they built that into their architecture.
Sure. So we've been talking about this, I guess, a lot from the perspective of a individual end user or consumer.
Right.
What does this all mean for enterprise users? What do they need to be thinking about? Is this a solution they can take advantage of, or when do you think it might be something that they can take advantage of? You were just talking about that example of the highway.
Yeah. So enterprise users, like it's great. It's choice, right? And it's not just choice in urban areas. It's opportunities to get pretty high bandwidth connectivity in non-urban areas, and to, for example, to link your disparate operations together far more efficiently. And say you have a network of gas stations across the country, and you want faster connections so that you can detect and reduce fraud, credit card fraud on purchases. Boom, like you can do it fast, and you don't have like a rural gas station that's in the middle of the highway, in the middle of nowhere, that doesn't even have a network connection.
Sure.
Or it's a dial-up and consumers won't wait. So I think there are opportunities now to have choice, or to extend your network where it didn't exist before. And that's great. There's also, that's as a user, but then there's participating in terms of as a supplier, as a service provider through that network. Like there are a lot of interesting things that are going to happen. Take I mentioned it before. Take that example of wireless services, wireless tower backhaul, right? In the U.S., most of our cellular towers are backhauled by fiber.
Mm-hmm.
It's the way our network is set up and run today. But if you look in Europe or in the developing world, it's mostly wireless. There's a lot of wireless, much more than in the U.S. market. And there's even some satellite, so it's tougher. Now factor in 5G. Okay, so now you're going to densify your cellular network so you have better frequency reuse in smaller areas, right? So let's just oversimplify 5G. Same amount of spectrum, but in a smaller area and reused more intensively geographically, right? So you have a bigger chunk of spectrum available to you, but a lot more handoffs as you go to more towers. But what that implies is many more towers, maybe 3 or 5 times the towers that you have today. So 5G is a great opportunity for equipment manufacturers for all that. On the other hand, who's going to backhaul all those towers? And how are they going to do it? And maybe, they can't all go by, they're not all going to have fiber networks available.
Right.
And so now, you get to start thinking about wireless backhaul, especially in the US. But all of a sudden now you have LEO 2.0, and you have some pretty legitimate bandwidth for satellite backhaul from towers, especially ones that are maybe, again, farther away from those dense urban areas where you risk saturation for the satellites.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of imagining this, I don't know, network of networks, right? And is it sort of a matter of least cost routing then, or, how's that play out?
Um, I think it's part of it's a lot of it's the opportunity of putting like broadband solutions where just wasn't feasible to have it before because there just wasn't fiber there, like
Yeah.
solving the rural consumer problem. It with the pandemic, everyone's people have been doing schooling from home, and I've had kids doing college remotely. Um, but for a big chunk of the population, and not just in the US, around the world, like they just don't have the bandwidth connections. And it's a real, and it lays bare a real economic divide in the opportunity for education. So it's a important problem to solve. And so when you open up like this sort of spread of bandwidth into secondary areas that have been bandwidth starved for years, it can be transformative, right? That
Yeah.
opens up a lot.
Indeed. Indeed. So great. Gosh, Mark, I really want to thank you for having this conversation with me today. This has been so informative, and I feel like we could talk about this for hours and we still wouldn't scratch the surface. I do want to give a moment for our listeners to go ahead and ask a few questions. And for those of you out there that are listening, please feel free to put any questions either in the chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring those. I did have a couple of questions come in during our conversation, so let's have a look at those.
Okay.
One of the questions is, will the FCC stop granting licenses to launch at some point? We only have thousands of LEO satellites today, and there have already been close calls, including the recent Starlink OneWeb collision scare that just happened a couple days ago.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, I think that's a precursor to future scares. That's not going away. Not to split hairs, I think I'm not a regulatory expert, so I can't go too far down the rabbit hole. But the launch licenses specifically would be FAA, but or possibly Commerce. But in terms of the systems, yeah, that's FCC driven. And with the four systems that we were talking about earlier, that's a lot, right? It is thousands of satellites. And my background's originally in astrodynamics, and it scares the heck out of me. Can't lie on that. So I share that same concern. I think what has happened up to this point is, these systems are have seemed so visionary, like thousands of satellites, who's going to do that? And so the notion was implied, I think, was let the market figure it out. Not all these systems are going to be built, and you can see OneWeb stumbling. But having said that, I personally feel that both in the US and internationally, we're way behind on doing enforced debris standards and better coordination at that level. Right now, there are recommendations, there are voluntary things, which work okay, but we can't fool around on debris. Debris is such a serious problem. And once you mess it up and you have a Kessler syndrome kind of cascading effect, that doesn't clean up overnight. And I'm glad that ventures like Astroscale are trying to address it, but the physics of that problem are terrifying. So I share that concern with the listener. Thanks for asking that. I would like to see actually a heavier regulatory presence. And you don't usually hear that from engineers and technologists in Silicon Valley, especially, but I think everyone now recognizes the problem, and it's really an extension of a greater awareness of Earth ecology and global warming, but in a different vein in orbit. And it does these, once you tip the scale, it's hard to climb back.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes I wonder if we're not too late, right, with some of those solutions already.
Yes. Yes, it's very concerning.
Yeah. Okay. So let me see here. Here's another question.
Okay.
The satellite operators will need to land the capacity. So what role will ground station providers play? And do you think those owning the entire value chain win?
Another excellent insight in that question. So some of the constellation ventures being contemplated here are pretty vertically oriented, vertically integrated. So they do control that value chain. And that, of course, that is disruptive, and that makes things very challenging for the ground station operators, or the ground industry, let's say. So definitely that's a threat. I should point out, though, that Telesat Lightspeed, for example, does not approach the market as a vertically integrated service provider to the end user. They see themselves providing that basic highway and then working with the ground equipment, ground services industry to then extend it out. So they have a very different approach, and I think that's much more industry friendly, if you will. We should also keep in mind the non-ISL solutions, OneWeb, if it gets built, has an intensive network of ground stations to build out for their system to operate. So that's an opportunity if it happens. All of these systems have to get landing rights on a per country basis. So if you're in that industry in a particular country, then if you can facilitate regulatory landing rights, then that puts you in a better position in working with some of these companies. And then even for those systems that are very vertically oriented, it's hard enough to build and deploy these systems. So if you can develop custom applications, say for specific vertical industries, great, have at it. So it's a system extension kind of thing. So I think that's an opportunity, but the fundamental underlying premise of the question is correct, that those owning the entire value chain are at an advantaged position. And always pay attention to who owns the customer. And so, like a Starlink going directly to the user, they own the customer. But a Telesat Lightspeed, it's a different animal.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so I had another question come in. What about last mile connectivity? How has this changed over the last several years? Things have gone from, I think what they're asking, right? That, people are cutting cable and all that. So what do you see there?
So I would say that there are two ends to that cable that may be cut. All right. One is the in terms of content for the content, like what we would call streaming market, but for LEO 1.0, that didn't exist, really. It was in its infancy at best. Well, actually, it didn't exist because think about it. Google was founded in 2008 by, if I got that right, and really 2009, 2016, bought YouTube. Or, no, I'm sorry, 2006, off by 10 years. 2006, bought YouTube. I'm probably off, but YouTube didn't exist in Leo 1.0, is my point. And all these streaming services, Netflix fought their way into the market, and now the whole cable monopoly, having that one fiber connection to your door, that's kind of been busted up, those cable packages. And so the content providers, the studios and stuff, said, hey, we want a direct reach to the customer. And even though we love that addiction of getting that slice of the cable fees, we want more. We want more control. And so now you have Disney Plus, and Netflix is doing its own content, and Amazon Prime has arrived on the scene, and they have their own content. And so the whole content market has drastically changed. It didn't exist before. It's actually gone through several iterations since then. And we've now entered into a market on the content side, which drives a lot of subscriptions, to a Wild West period where cable packages are not really marketable per se. And it's just a wild streaming world, and it hasn't reconsolidated yet. So that's upstream. Downstream on the last mile is related to that, because like I've daughters in their 20s, and they have no cable package. They don't have a home telephone. They don't. If you ask them what a triple play is, like, I think baseball, they're not thinking cable offerings. Like, so that's come and gone. And so now all they want is, they just want an IP connection, and they want it as fast as possible. And that's all they care about. And so whether it comes through a cable, through a terrestrial wireless solution, through DSL, as far as DSL can go, or from a satellite, couldn't care less. So the last mile has drastically changed.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh my gosh. I think for all of us, because yeah, I've eliminated cable. I've eliminated my home phone, my landline. I've done all these things that you're saying, and I'm not a youngster, so
Yeah.
like even old people are doing it too. So
yeah, no. I mean, it's, it has crossed the chasm, right? It's not just early adopters that were going like, screw it, I don't need cable, or I don't need this package, or I don't need my plain old telephone service, the POTS, right? Yeah, it's crossed the chasm to mass adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for taking time to be here today. It's been such an informative session, and I know that, like I said, we've barely even scratched the surface. So I'm sure that we would love to have you come back again.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be on the Pulse. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I also want to thank the Mobile Satellite Users Association, MSUA, for hosting the Pulse. And if you're interested in learning more about MSUA, please visit msua.org and learn how you can join and become a member, or also receive our weekly newsletter, which gives you the latest in everything that's happening in the satellite industry and beyond. So 5G, broadband, all of that. It's definitely a worthwhile thing to receive. So visit msua.org to get access to all of that great information. And thanks so much. We'll see you next time on The Pulse.